Today, the time now, we are 40 years after the birth of Christ. 40 years after the birth of Christ. The scene for today is the home of a Jewish man named Jesse in the town of Jericho. He is a man about 60. He and his wife live alone in the hotel they own and operate there in Jericho. As the scene opens, Jesse has gone to the door of his room to meet a strange man who is obviously a Roman. The man has been let into the house by Leah, his wife. We know this man as St. Luke, who is doing research for a book he is writing on the life of Christ.
Yes, I am Jesse Ben-Hadad, Jesse of Jericho, if you wish. Forgive my smile at that name, sir. I've been here in Jericho long enough I should feel like a fixture here, part of the local scenery. But after all these years, I still would have answered more easily to the name Jesse of Bethlehem. But come in out of that drafty hall. I have a fire stirred up here in our living quarters. We can talk in here. Please have a seat on the cushioned bench. I'm sorry I kept you waiting. It isn't often a Jew gets a chance to keep a citizen of Rome waiting. Luke, you call yourself Luke a physician. Well. And I could tell at a glance that you are a Roman and not an Israelite. That slight but telltale swagger to your shoulders, that so very clean tunic you are wearing, and the painful way you speak our language, as if its very syllables are like salt in your Western mouth. Now, don't be embarrassed. If we are to talk, you will have to grant me the same license all Jericho does. Jesse the Innkeeper, the blasphemous old Jew who laughs in the synagogue, tells off the Romans to their faces, and still gets by on his wits, if not his wisdom. But you spoke the magic word to my wife Leah that will make me keep a fairly civil tongue. So you know our son Benjamin, know him in Jerusalem. And it was really my son who sent you to hear from me the story? Think of that. He had laughed at it along with everyone else. It was his laughter more than the others that made me swear by the eyes of the prophets I would never mention it again. Simply shows you, Luke, you must never be bothered by the laughter of youth, for it isn't the scornful affair that it seems. I know, Luke. I too so well remember laughing one night long ago. Laughing because I didn't know what else to do at the time. You asked me if I remember Bethlehem. Yes, I remember Bethlehem all too well. God knows there have been countless times when I'd have gladly forgotten. But how long has it been since your Caesar's first census? 40 years? That long the memory's been with me. Maturing through the years, of course, but still sharply bright. Remembering that other inn, that other night sky. Canopy for a world that for an hour was a different world. We were married there in Bethlehem, Leah and I. I worked for her father there at his inn. No dowry came with Leah. She was dowry enough. Tall with the grace of any tree they boast about in Lebanon. Dark brown eyes of a Judean with a low musical voice like the brooks on Mount Hermon. I loved her, still do. But love is never for long an escape from the harshness of the world, Luke. Leah and I knew what it was like to live in a world under Caesar. Any Caesar who wants his face stamped not just on your coins but on your soul, so that existence becomes only that. All life's simple joys must be treasured quickly under constant fear. The work which should make us men, making us drudges. And night, a short pause between burdens. and never a foothold on the certainty that the struggle's worth it. Never a consistent assurance that the God who caused it all means to stand by it and see it all through. Do you stare to hear such rantings from a child of pious Israel? Then you should read some of our holy books, the ones the Pharisees never mention, the ones the priests ignore. The book of Job, for one, or a little scroll called Ecclesiastes. And to have all that rebellion, all that constant but unspoken protest nagging away at my inner being, and then for it to happen, for that night to take place. Noticed by so few, and yet. But business was brisk that season, you see. Turning guests away we were. My old father-in-law was almost cheerful, sacking up quite a lot of money. An irony of ironies, it was all your Caesar's doing. His new law for a head tax in the provinces demanded that every mother's son return to the town of his birth to register for taxing. Our inn there in Bethlehem was crowded as never before. We had tents pitched in the alleys, bedding on the roof. So when this young fellow of about my age came along that evening imploring us for lodging, he was just another like the many I'd been turning away all day. How are you going to know life's moments when they come, Luke? The great hours, I mean, the shining hours that later can mean so much. They come walking up looking like any other hour, and always when you're busy. Always when you're so convinced that something else you're doing is so important. And you let them go by and never know. I think that's what has rubbed me the rawest all these years. That I would have sent that young couple away. Oh, kindly enough, with that cheap, easy kindness you use when you're so sure of yourself in saying no to strangers. But Leah saved me. It was she who noticed the woman. Maybe the man had told me, I don't know. We busy ones seldom listen. It was Leah who thought of a stable out back, and I laughed. That was my contribution. I laughed. A little proud of Leah, a little embarrassed at myself, a little intrigued with the thought that if this business continued, we could use an annex built out back where that old stable stood. Leah awakened me long after midnight. I awoke with that abrupt, complete alertness which always proves the rest of you has been awake long before your mind is agreed. I awoke to a different world, Luke. I tell you, a different world. There was my Leah, with a look on her face I'd only seen hints of before. Her normal reserve all shattered, her words a jumble, a torrent. She couldn't seem to stop. All about this baby she had helped birth in the stable, and weird visions the mother had told her about how this was no ordinary child, but the gift of God Himself. She went on and on about this. Well, normally such a yarn would have made me angry. But this night it brought me running. There in a silence you could fairly feel. You've never heard a Judean town really silent until your ears throb with it. Not so much as the bark of a dog or the creak of a wagon wheel. It was as if the whole town were asleep, the whole world were asleep, as if the very sky had caught its breath. Only the sound of the stairs as we hurried out and the crunch of the stubble in the yard beneath our feet. Halfway across the yard, we heard it and saw it. But how will I tell you, man? Here the words always sag and fail. It was silent, and yet I heard music. It was pitch dark, and yet I saw light. The music, it was the music of life that you know is there, but never quite hear. Oh, you nearly hear it in the spring sometimes. You can catch it as an overtone in the laughter of children. There are times when you feel it's about to be played, but that night, bless you, it was being strummed from every treetop and hymned from every cloud bank. And the light. There's a moment just before dawn that almost has it. The sky's still black, but everything around you beginning to reflect that coming wonder. That's how we felt, standing hand in hand there in the dark, almost as if we too were luminous, reflecting some untraceable radiance. I was certain that had we stood in the distance, we surely would have seen some tremendous signal fire of glory had been lighted over Bethlehem that night. I don't know how long we stood there in the dark, letting the night speak to us what can't be spoken. But then Leah told me of some shepherds who had come while I slept, all hesitant and uncertain but determined young chaps, stammering through their story of a sky punctured by voices, even singing of peace coming to earth. They had all entered the stable ill at ease, but they'd left their heads back, their eyes flashing praise like they'd been to the temple on a high holy day. It was then I could wait no longer to go in. I didn't stay long, just long enough to pretend to see that all was well. Long enough to worship with my eyes wide open, to etch that scene indelibly here behind my forehead. A peasant girl and her baby, with her husband hovering nearby. That's all. Then I went back out under the stars while Leah busied herself in that way of hers that can make even a manger seem for a moment a cradle. Now, Luke, I'm a reasonable man. Oh, I've doubted my senses many times since. But that night, it was all so sure. And I found myself wondering why I was so willing to accept this incredible claim without even knowing what it all meant. But somehow, I knew I had always been waiting for that night, and that music, and that light, and this child, and this claim, which my heart would never have dared voice, but which the frightened shepherd boys had stammered. And somehow I've never been able to write it all off as a pack of lies. Somehow I knew that what is best in me is linked with what is highest among those stars. My heartbeat here, at least a feeble echo of some heart beating out there. But what had come of it all? This that the long-faced rabbis tell me of how God once took common dirt in Eden and breathed into its dustiness a speck of himself, so that a human being became a living soul. But was God wise to do that? Can human flesh stand that? Can humanity bear this imprint of God's image? Was humankind to be the Eternal's big mistake, too flawed ever to be salvaged? But Luke, what if God should decide to abide by the rules of his own game? What if he should decide to get into this, not just with his breath, but with himself, to be just as limited as we are, just as prone to suffering, to risk our sorrows, even our death, take the full and undiluted dose of his own medicine. Then he'd know, and we'd know. And if he did that, if, I say, it surely would have happened not in Caesar's palace or Herod's court, but quietly somewhere, unannounced as it were. God arriving incognito till he could get his bearings in this life among a people who, for whatever virtues they had lost, had kept alive expectancy, had kept looking for him to turn up among them. Well, that was 40 years ago. We sold the inn there in Bethlehem shortly after my father-in-law's death. We came here to Jericho, and here we've stayed. And Luke, in my way, in my wondering, ranting way, I've been faithful to that night. Oh, nothing ever came of it. Well, there was a flurry a few years ago when a teacher from Nazareth came through Jericho. It was he whom our son Benjamin followed to Jerusalem. But I understand the Nazarene got in trouble there. Oh, but you'd know more about that, you being from Jerusalem. Well, you might have even... Wait. Yes. You in Jerusalem, knowing our Benjamin, making this trip, hearing my story. And you've listened without amusement or scorn. You're smiling only now. You've come not just to hear, but to tell. You know what came of it all. That night, I mean. You know the sequel to Bethlehem.